are different levels of propaganda, but ultimately it's really what I call coercive thought reform. And it
Yeah.
uses psychological manipulation, to bring those agendas to fruition.
Hey, welcome to Return to Reason. My name is David Craig. In her previous work as an intelligence analyst, my guest today focused on various aspects of Russian and Soviet politics, including communist media and propaganda. With a BA in journalism and international relations and a master's in history from University of Southern California, Stella Morabito is expertly qualified to speak to a phenomena most of the Western world experienced during the handling of a COVID pandemic. I can't wait to ask her about her book, The Weaponization of Loneliness.
Today, a special episode of Return to Reason, where knowledge and wisdom intersect.
Well, Stella, thank you so much for being with us today on Return to Reason. We're going to talk about a topic that has arguably been on everyone's minds for the last 3 years, whether they know it or not. And you just recently wrote a book that's called The Weaponization of Loneliness. First of all, how are you doing today? And tell me maybe why you wrote this book.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, David, for having me on. I'm thrilled to be here. So I wrote the book because I felt that people did not have a conscious enough understanding of how these kind of psychological manipulations that we've been dealing with, and not just for the past 3 years, by the way, but for a long time, but it really exploded on the scene with COVID, as you know. And the effect that isolation has on us and has on us socially, I mean, on all of society. And it's not just isolation, it's the fear of isolation, the fear of ostracism that causes us to comply and conform with so many bad agendas. And we really do need to learn more about it. And, honestly, we need to snap out of it if we're going to preserve freedom.
Well, I think a lot of people can relate with the idea of loneliness. A lot of people felt isolated over the last number of years. I know there's a lot of times I've got friends and family, different events that they had where they weren't allowed to go because of things they believed or stood for, or families were divided. How is loneliness used as a tactic, maybe through history and even in the past number of years, to enforce a sense of tyranny, or maybe to even exposes tyrannical leaders?
Well, yes, this is a recurring pattern throughout history, especially modern history.
Mm-hmm.
But I think everybody needs to, first of all, understand that isolation is the number one weapon that's used by any tyrant, whether it's just a one-on-one gaslighting relationship in a dysfunctional relationship, how the gaslighter always tries to separate the other partner from social interactions, or whether it's on the playground or in, a toxic work environment with a toxic boss that marginalizes someone, gets them fearful of losing their job, or all the way up to a very dangerous cult leader, like, for example, Jim Jones, who isolated all of his recruits in the jungle.
Yeah.
In 1978, there was that massacre, mass suicide of 1,000 people just followed his orders. And then, of course, all the way up to world-class dictators. And you can look at what they call North Korea the hermit kingdom, because they are so isolated. They are not exposed to any other narrative other than the propaganda that they hear day in and day out.
Yep.
So this is the number one weapon of tyranny. In fact, if your listeners are familiar with Hannah Arendt's epic book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she doesn't go into it in depth, but she does note that terror doesn't really have a grip on people unless they're isolated against one another.
Yeah.
And therefore, the main concern of all tyrannical governments is to bring that isolation about. And so what we saw in COVID is kind of like the masks of all of these kind of tyrannical forces coming off and enforcing our isolation. And not just our isolation in terms of house arrest and all of these mandates and covering up your face all the time and all of that, but actually instilling hostilities where hostilities had not existed before. This is also a common pattern that you'll find in Soviet Russia and Mao's China's Cultural Revolution. it's a common pattern to get family members to become disloyal to one another or actually start pointing fingers at one another. And we saw that come out enormously during COVID.
Well, that was an interesting point is there's even this labeling that would go on, that you would find that out of people, we'd end up labeling people whether they chose to be vaccinated or not, which is you would think it'd be their own right to choose what they do and put into their body, or how people spoke, or the fact that if people weren't wearing masks and people are trying to force them to, you notice this group think idea where you almost come in this bullying tactics to make someone else conform to how maybe the general population might be conforming, which was really interesting to see that come out of normal people that you thought might have been your friends. It's amazing how groupthink can make those type of things come forth.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what propaganda is all about, is to kind of develop that sort of groupthink. It's actually, there are different levels of propaganda, but ultimately it's really what I call coercive thought reform. It's a form of coercive thought reform. And so you brought up an excellent point about the what I would call the smear words, like anti-vaxxer, for example.
Totally.
That you will find throughout modern history, but especially in the, I say the United States, North America, in the past, 20, 30, 40 years, the decades where political correctness has really gotten a hold, that demonization and demonization campaigns are absolutely central to getting people to shut up about what they believe. Anti-vaxxer is just one of, you could probably think of 100 different terms that we've got for all different agendas that they're trying to push through. Bigot, hater, now white supremacist, conspiracy theorist is another one, a big one. You got the different quote phobias, you're transphobic. The list just goes on and on. Now we've got election denier, there's a whole series of deniers. It's all smear words meant to trigger that fear of being ostracized. And it's been very powerful. But when we wake up to it, and I think people actually are, there are some hopeful signs out there that these things are losing their sting.
It's almost a dehumanization attempt as well.
Yes.
So during COVID, 2.5 years, and now we're on the fallout of it for the last year or so, did COVID just expose leaders that might have tyrannical impulses at heart, or was this a planned thing by a group of people? Because I know there's a lot of people have the thought of there is this common conception that there is this big, grandiose plan that's executed by a they in a back room. In your opinion, did this just expose tyrannical people and at their root?
Well, I think to a great extent it did. And, when you look at the history of what we call utopian radical revolutions, there's always a grand plan. And it's not a secret. You don't have to be a quote conspiracy theorist to see it. They come right out, like, for example, the Great Reset. They just come right out and say what they think, we ought to do, what we ought to eat, where what we should be allowed to say. And they just come right out and say, hey, we're going to rule over you. There's no secret there. Although when you call them on it, they try to pretend that they never said that, but it's all out there. They've published this stuff, and the World Economic Forum just got together in Davos. They had a big panel. What was it on quote disinformation, the clear and present danger? It's all out there, and there is this impulse in certain sections, certain core of human beings that have this sort of totalitarian impulse, and it's there. You can't deny it. You see it happening over and over and over again. And the free world, or looking at the United States and our Constitution, is particularly our First Amendment, is really kind of miraculous, because this other impulse, this totalitarian impulse, is just so hardwired into so many dictators throughout the course of history that it's pretty amazing that it seems like that totalitarian strain is more of the default position of humanity.
Interesting.
And so it's no quote conspiracy theory. It's default. And that is why there is such a concerted effort in so many ways to undermine the First Amendment of the US Constitution or free speech in general, because when we can speak freely to one another, they don't really stand a chance. When we feel open and able to speak freely, we exchange ideas, we're able to get at the truth. And yeah, all kinds of other ideas creep in there, but the antidote to that is more free speech, not less. And censorship is really where you get disinformation. That's how you get disinformation.
So propaganda seems to be central in terms of continuing to weaponize loneliness. If you don't mind, could you also just define what propaganda is for our audience? And also, secondly, how can we be aware of what propaganda we should be watching out for? Because obviously you have WEF in their most recent one, they're talking about disinformation, which is a form of propaganda. And now you've got misinformation and disinformation working against each other, just coming from each party. So what is propaganda, and how can we be aware of it?
Okay, well, if I had to define it, and I'm sure there's plenty of different definitions out there, but I would call it a conditioning process through the mass media, particularly a media monopoly, and that you get with big tech and all the institutions that fall under, that whole monopoly. It's a conditioning process by which a narrative is pushed forward to kind of drown out any other narrative.
Yeah.
And it uses psychological manipulation to to bring those agendas to fruition.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist on its own. It exists along with agitation, and that's where you get into mobs and the mob mindset and everything to kind of enforce the propaganda.
That's a good definition. So with your book, The Weaponization of Loneliness, if you could summarize, what would be the main goal of you writing this book? What point are you trying to get across to your readers?
I guess ultimately I'd like people to understand that, first of all, whenever we self-censor, we're doing all the heavy lifting for tyrants. We're giving oxygen to all of those bad agendas. We're actually affecting public opinion. When we self-censor, we're actually helping them to regulate public opinion. Now, everybody has a different threshold for what they can do in terms of expressing what they believe. I understand that. But I want people to understand that when you think you're getting relief by complying with the propaganda, all you're doing is supporting the propaganda and digging society in deeper to a state of unfreedom, really.
Yeah.
And that's number one. That's one of the things I want people to understand, is that self-censorship is extremely destructive to freedom. You may know 100 people who think exactly the way you do, but they don't feel they're allowed to express it.
Yeah.
And so you never know who those
Yeah.
people are. And that's exactly what totalitarians want. They want to shut down the marketplace of ideas. They want to shut down our ability to communicate.
Is there any form of censorship that is good, though? Because obviously there are some forms of censorship we have. It's becoming really vague, and really broad lines now are painted in terms of what's censored or not.
Right.
Where is that line?
Well, I'm talking about political censorship.
Yes.
I'm not talking about pornography. I'm not talking about where we want to protect children
Of course.
who don't really, who aren't capable of understanding a lot of things until they become, their prefrontal cortex has developed with their. So I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. I'm talking about political censorship, the general exchange in public discourse of ideas, the ability at a university of all places to investigate what's true and what isn't, in terms of philosophy, or now it's even in the hard sciences. I mean, it's gotten so crazy. And the reason it's gotten so crazy is through our compliance with self-censorship, which all boils down to that fear of being ostracized. But you may feel a little relief from being ostracized when you comply and conform. But ultimately, as more and more people conform, you lose all of your freedoms in society. So we've got to become aware of how this process works, how these patterns have repeated themselves throughout history. And there is even a science to it that doesn't seem to be investigated as much as it was after World War II. For example, with Solomon Ash's conformity experiments, which are fascinating. One of the things she found was that if that illusion of unanimity is punctured by just one voice, like if there's another person out there who agrees with you and you manage to overcome your fear and express something, that drops conformity of the group quite a bit, a
Wow.
huge amount.
Yeah, it's a
And
great
so
point.
this is something we need to understand. And I think the left has used that. Like if you go to a town hall meeting, they get their shills in
Sure.
different places in the meeting, and in order to embolden this illusion of an agenda that's not really has majority support.
Well, a great example of that is I'm sure you're aware of what happened in Canada 1 year ago, actually, right now. We were in the middle of it in terms of the convoy of mass trucks heading to Ottawa. And that event transformed Canada, whether our government or legacy medias want to attest to it or not, in regards to seeing people realize I'm not alone in how I think. There are so many other people in this country that feel they might not know how to articulate it, but they know this is not right in my gut. This doesn't make sense. I'm being forced to do things I don't believe in. It's my body. I can do what I want with it, that type of thing. And the mass amount of people, not only that just converged on Ottawa, which was is honestly incredible to be a part of and just see that camaraderie that came forth. But at the same time, knowing that there are people and voices all across Canada being represented. That's a great example of what you were just talking about. If you can talk and avoid that self-censorship and start communicating what you think, you'll realize there are more people that think like what you do. So were you able to follow that story much of the convoy in Canada?
Oh yeah, I did. I mean, I found it really chilling. I mean, people couldn't even get a cup of coffee down the street. They weren't allowed because they were part of the convoy, or they had bank accounts frozen. I mean, this is like beyond the pale, and I think that it probably opened a lot of eyes to what was going on. I mean, some people they're far gone, but. Sure. I think most people understand that. Unfortunately, they aren't, necessarily in the seats of power. But you're absolutely right. One of my favorite books that I cite in my book, The Weaponization of Loneliness, it's actually a long essay by Václav Havel called "The Power of the Powerless." And it was published in 1978 in the underground press in the Soviet bloc country of Czechoslovakia. Havel later became president. He had been the Czech Republic. He had been a dissident, but he wrote this incredible essay that was like a shot in the arm to a lot of the other dissidents. And one of his points, the power of the powerless lies all in the hidden sphere of life. When you think about it, our personal relationships, our one-on-one relationships is really the big prize of tyrants. That's what they're going after. They capture all the other institutions, but they still want to control, what you think, what you say, and with whom you associate. And I think that one of the points he brings up in the essay is that even if nobody says anything, when you speak the truth, you will have illumined it, and people generally cannot unhear it or unsee it, and it has an effect that these totalitarians can't really control, but it becomes part of it changes. It causes a ripple effect. It causes a ripple effect in thinking and behavior, but you have to keep that alive. Wow. You can't just stop talking at some point. This, I think, is part of the problem that we face today, is when we did just kind of assume in America that our First Amendment rights were sacrosanct and nobody's really going to go after them, because it's right there in the Constitution. Well, no, I mean, they're going after. They have this misinformation, or whatever they call it, disinformation governance board. It kind of disappeared, but it'll be back, where they want to do top-down censorship. And of course, the whole COVID thing that we went through, we can't assume that, they aren't going to come back. I mean, the power elites in the corporate world, who I'm talking about, WEF and so on, they've got other things going on. I mean, they're never going to give up. They've got like a superhuman stamina when it comes to power mongering, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's almost like a person in the grip of a psychotic episode. They don't sleep, they don't eat, they just are going for, and this is kind of the behavior. They are never going to give up on that. So that's why the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
That's good.
As the adage says, we don't just, think it'll all go away once we've got it written in our Constitution. We have to keep being aware, we have to keep talking and keep up and expand those good, healthy personal relationships where we can talk to other people. And because you have to expand and do more outreach because there is so much brokenness. I mean, family brokenness over the decades.
Well, if we can capture that type of drive that you alluded to as a superhuman sense in terms of keeping up our freedoms and our conversations and not being ashamed to talk about. If you think of how our countries were built, that is the basis of democracy, is having open conversations, letting the best ideas stand, let each idea sharpen each other and fight against each other and see which one comes out on top. And it's a really good point, is that I hope if people are watching, as they're watching, they just get the point of don't be afraid to talk about what you think. Even don't be afraid of groupthink or what people might ostracize you, because your opinion, these conversations, as you alluded to, over the dining room table, over the dinner table across our nations, are so vital because they do shape where our country's going. And you talked about an attack on relationships, and there's been a clear, I'll say, an all-out assault on the nuclear family. On the family. That's clear for years and years and years as part of a greater tactic, in my opinion, of what is trying to be accomplished. Maybe talk about a little bit what that has happened, how propaganda has been destroying the family, because at the same time, as you see families break down, in a sense, you can see our nations start to, I hope they don't fully crumble, but they start to get cracks in terms of what our nation's built on.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't have strong communities without strong families, not really, really strong, organic. I'm not talking about the kind of community that they talk about at Davos. I'm talking about real communities where people care about one another, what you saw in Ottawa last year. I mean, this sense of camaraderie that develops, and that has to be nurtured. We have to, and you're right. About the brokenness and how this has happened through so many different agenda items that seem almost tailor-made to break down the family. I mean, the United States, we had the no-fault divorce, the whole sexual revolution thing. That all of that is part and parcel of family breakdown. And of course, it brings on a lure. The lure of sexual pleasure, all that stuff plays into it. And of course, Hollywood and all these, the art institutions and the arts and everything kind of promote that, so that you become like a nerd or, some other name to kind of discredit you from society if you're not on board with it. And we see this in universities and everything. So there's been not just cracks, I mean, huge crumbling. However, there are still very strong families in place. And a lot of people who are having children don't subscribe to all this other stuff. It's almost like these totalitarians are in a race against what might happen if strong families take over, as it were, if they become more of a stronger force in society. And that's why it's so important to them to invade the institution of education, especially K-12 and preschool now, with all this confusing queer theory, gender ideology, the trans stuff, and all of that. It's all meant not just to divide us from one another, but even for a small child to divide them within themselves, so that they don't even have this sense of identity as being male or female, and so on and so forth. So all of this stuff is of a piece. It's all kind of tied together with the brokenness that totalitarians need in order to maintain social control and to capture.
I love what you said about strong families, because it really is a foundation and bedrock of also what we're built on. You look at the strong families through history and how influential they've been. And well, you've got very unique experience, especially when it comes to propaganda. You worked with the CIA during the Cold War and an expert in that area, especially with the Soviet Union at the height, and then also at the fall. Could you first off tell us, how did you get involved? I'm curious, how did you get involved with the CIA? And then maybe tell us a little bit about what your work was at the height of it.
Well, I've always had a fascination with psychological operations.
Yeah.
That's always, I mean, it's kind of, when you get right down to it, all wars are either won or lost, a lot of times just based on, demoralization or some kind of psyop. So I work in a couple different offices there doing analysis, but one of the offices in particular had to do with media analysis and looking at how, all the different ways that maybe the U.S. was portrayed or who was meeting with whom. There was some Kremlinology involved, who was up, who was down. But one of the things I noticed, you read Pravda and all these other, rags that communists put out, it's their only source of, information, their narratives. And one of the narratives they pushed was that the United States, created AIDS in order to, attack Black Americans. So it just was such, it wasn't just an eye opener. I mean, this is typical. This is sort of the pattern that you get in any kind of one-party state.
Yeah.
And sadly, in our education system, I'm not, 100%, I don't know a lot about Canada, but in the U.S., history is just kind of gone as, except in really, really good schools, as a subject. I mean, you've got all these little fads that they follow, and you don't study civics anymore, the Constitution. And even any kind of content knowledge. So ignorance itself has become very isolating.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Youth just don't have a handle on it. But anyway, I'm getting kind of off topic there. So yes, I was there for about a decade, following Soviet media and propaganda and disinformation. I mean, the folks who keep calling their opponents the source of disinformation tend to be the ones who are most responsible for disinformation. That's a projection.
Totally, it's a projection, pointing the finger at someone else for what you're actually doing yourself.
Right,
that happens
exactly.
Quite often. Well, it's very unique expertise you have, and that's why I think this book that you wrote is fascinating and a must-read. Everyone who's watching, you should pick up the book. It's a great book, The Weaponization of Loneliness. Stella, I really wish we had more time. I think I'm going to have to start a 3-hour podcast so we can just kind of go on and on about this. But quickly, before we wrap up, would you let people know how they can follow you, connect with you if they want to know what you're up to and what you're writing? How can they best follow you?
Thank you very much, David. I do have a personal blog, StellaMorabito.net. You can follow me on Twitter at Stella_Morabito. That's my handle. And the book you can find anywhere books are sold online, particularly Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Goodreads. It's widely available, and I hope you pick up a copy.
That's awesome. Well, The Weaponization of Loneliness, must read. You got to know what's going on in terms of when it comes to tyrannical leaders and how they try to split people up. I'm looking forward to reading that again, Stella. Thank you so much for your time. We'll have to do this again soon.
Thank you very much, David. It was great talking to you.
You are an essential part of this series. Support truth, knowledge, and wisdom by sharing this show with a friend. Visit returntoreason.tv. There, you can subscribe to our newsletter by clicking Become an Insider. Get the latest articles, episodes, and exclusive content. It's Return to Reason.